Hey, it's Plumber Tom. Thank you for watching my videos. I wanted to let you know really quickly about some awesome resources that I have for you as you're trying to learn. I have free practice tests that you can take if you're preparing for a state test. I have preparation courses that you can take that will guide you through that process if you're getting ready for a test. I have other courses that can help you in learning the plumbing trade. So make sure to check out those resources. You can find a link in the comments below. When you participate in those courses, you're helping me to be able to create more content. So I really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching. Hello, welcome to this presentation video for the International Plumbing Code. My name is Thomas, and in this video, we are going to look at Chapter 8, which is Indirect / Special Waste. This is a form of drainage piping that is used in particular situations. We're going to look exactly at what that is, when that should be used, and we'll talk about why. So let's get started. Before we get started into that though, let me just hit on a couple of reminders. Number one, anytime that you're studying the International Code, you know that I encourage you to actually read it. I will take you slide by slide through each section. We'll talk about it, but look, you've got to get to know the words on the page. You've got to get to know how those connect to what I'm talking about. So make sure to read it. And I would encourage you to follow along. Get out your book, look at this while we go. Pause the video if you want, but make sure that your understanding from the video is connecting to your book, and that will make you all the more prepared when it's time for you to take a test. All right, let's get into it. All right, here we are, International Plumbing Code, Chapter 8, Indirect or Special Waste. Let's have a look at what is indirect waste. Well, a waste pipe is a drain pipe, right? We learned from definitions a soil pipe is a drain pipe that contains fecal matter. It's for the toilets and all of that stuff. But a waste pipe is any other drain. It can branch off of the building drain or stacks or other things. But a waste pipe is a drain, and an indirect waste means that we have a pipe running to a drain. Both of them are drains, but there's an actual disconnect. There is a space between them. They are not locked and sealed together. So that's the important thing that you need to understand about indirect waste. These are drain pipes with a break, an intentional break between them. And there are some important scenarios that we need to use this. As you can imagine, this is all about protection, especially against backflow or against contamination into our fixtures. So let's consider, why do we need indirect waste? There are a few situations where the fixtures like sinks or appliances like washing machines would be very adversely affected if drainage were to back up into them. And drains back up at times. That's just a part of drainage systems over time. Knowing that, there are some scenarios where if we create a break, a disconnect between the drain, or rather an indirect drain, right? Then we can eliminate contaminants from a backing up sewer drain or other drain from coming in. So here we have, for example, the drains underneath a commercial kitchen sink. These drains are indirect waste. The water or fluids from the sinks will go down into the floor sink. But if that floor sink were ever to back up, that sewer waste or whatever is going to flood the floor before it can get up into the sinks where food would be prepared. And obviously, if, drains back up into the food prep sinks, that could contaminate food, which goes directly into our bodies. You start to see the picture, right? Why we have to do this? All right. Now, before we get too far into this chapter, we have to understand the difference between two terms that are commonly used throughout this chapter. These are terms that are available back in Chapter 2, where we look at definitions. The terms are air gap and air break. What is the difference between an air gap and an air break? We'll look at specifics and details of the definitions, but let's just get an idea. An air gap is an actual physical gap between the indirect waste pipe, represented in this picture by the gray line that's coming horizontally, dropping vertically down into the receptacle, and the receptacle being a floor sink, a floor drain, somewhere that indirect waste can drain into. So the idea here being with the gap that the indirect waste pipe is above the flood level rim of the receptacle being a floor sink or floor drain. Now, what's an air brake? The air brake then is an indirect waste pipe, again represented by the gray horizontal dropping down into the waste receptacle, but this time the indirect waste pipe goes below the flood level rim. It actually dips down into the floor sink. And there are different scenarios where that would be okay. And throughout this chapter, we're going to see they'll either say you can use an air gap or an air brake and an air gap. But obviously of the two, the air gap is going to give us a greater amount of protection. We saw this back in Chapter 6 of the International Plumbing Code when we look at backflow prevention. And air gap is one of the best forms of backflow prevention if we're protecting our potable water. In this chapter, we're not only looking at protecting potable water, but just our fixtures and the drains themselves, trying to keep fixtures and appliances clean from that potential backup of contaminated drain waste. So air gap's the best. That's what we're going to see anytime they want to make sure that things are really well protected. So let's get right into these sections here. We're going to go to 801, which is the general, and 801.1 talks about the scope. So this is kind of covering whatever we're going to look at in this chapter. Here it is. This chapter shall govern the matters concerning indirect waste piping and special waste, just like we've talked about. This chapter shall further control matters concerning food handling establishments, sterilizers, humidifiers, clear wastewater, swimming pools, methods of providing air brakes and air gaps, and neutralizing devices for corrosive waste. That's the overview of this chapter, but these are some of the specific things or situations where we will apply indirect waste. 801.2 talks about this protection, and that's what this is all about, right? We're trying to make sure that we have those protections in place. What are we protecting? Here we have some of the things listed in 801.2. It is the protection of devices, appurtenances, appliances, apparatuses. They use a lot of those words, but I'm going to throw in there sinks and other fixtures because we see that listed in here. And these devices, appurtenances, appliances, sinks, apparatuses are used for sterilization. So you can imagine like we're sterilizing hospital equipment. Better make sure we're not going to get contamination from the drains. Humidification is putting, moisture into the air. We wouldn't want contaminated water or waste coming through the air that we're going to breathe. Distillation, that's the purifying or cleaning out of water by distilling it. Processing, cooling, ice storage, and food storage. These are all examples of things or scenarios that we need to protect. And what all of these have in common is that they discharge to the drainage system, as explained in this section. All those things are going to dump into the drain system. We know there has to be a connection. We know there has to be somewhere for that waste water to go, but we want to protect it. So we're protecting from backflow if the drains back up, flooding, fouling. Now, fouling is more than just backing up. We're talking about that awful, nasty, stinky, gross growth that happens inside of every drain naturally. If you've been a plumber for long and you've ever cut into an existing drain, you see it. You see what grows inside those drains. That's the sort of stuff that we don't want, for example, in our food prep sink. So we're preventing contamination and also the stoppage of drain. All those things are on the list of our protections when we're looking at these appliances, apparatuses, fixtures. Let's go on to section 802, where we look specifically at these indirect wastes and where they are required. I'm going to go through a number of these scenarios that are listed, starting with food handling equipment. Indirect wastes are most commonly seen in commercial kitchens, meaning like restaurant kitchens, other large cafeterias, anywhere you've got all that stainless steel sinks, countertops, and cooktops and everything for mass production of food. we're going to protect those. So anything food handling. Indirect waste are also required for clear water waste. Here we have an example of a condensate drain coming off of an air handler unit. The condensate from any sort of condensing heater or water heater or any of those. This is clear water waste, and that has to be handled through an indirect waste. We don't want the drains contaminating our furnaces, our air handlers, our water heaters, or anything else, right? And specifically, we're also going to have humidifiers. It's required anytime there's a humidifier. Now, I'm not talking about the little humidifier that you get out and you set it out in the room and it just blows a little water. You put some water in the small tank. We're talking about the humidifiers that are actually built into the mechanical system. These can be secured and attached to the side of ductwork. If we're doing a forced air system, that's what we have here. This would attach to the actual duct, and it's going to just dump water into the air. So it has a water supply, and because of condensation or the potential for some of that water to waste, we're going to run a line to the drain. You'll see these in mechanical rooms. They're in residential. They're definitely in commercial. And these humidifiers have to be protected by this indirect waste. So the drain coming off the bottom, going to go to a floor drain, and that's going to have an indirect waste connection. Indirect waste is also required anywhere that we have dishwashing machines or dishwashing sinks. So that's once again where we see them a lot used in commercial kitchens. You'll find a floor sink underneath the dishwasher. You'll find a floor sink underneath those 3 or 4 compartment sinks where they're washing dishes or even food. So again, required where we have the cleaning of dishes, utensils, things that we're going to actually eat off and put into our mouths. And finally, from 802.1, let me just point out that it does specifically state that these conditions where we're going to do indirect waste are generally in other than dwelling units. That's worded a little bit funny, but what that's saying is we don't have to worry about this in our typical residential setting. Now, does that mean contamination cannot happen? Well, no, these drains that you have in your sink could become quite awful. Our disposal kind of stinks sometimes, you know? And I really hesitate to take my fresh vegetables from the backyard and put them right against that stinky drain because that's a contaminated place, right? So it's not to say we don't run into contamination issues, but we're not going to handle it the same. We see this over in chapter 10 where we have grease traps and grease interceptors and we're trying to collect grease. You know, your residential kitchen, you get grease, food waste down those sinks, but we don't have to have a grease interceptor installed. Same here. We don't have to do indirect waste. Is it a good idea? Yeah, I don't know, probably, but it's not required. All right, once we've kind of got the general idea of where indirect waste is going to be used, we have some more specifics listed out in 802. So let's go to 802.1.1, and we're looking specifically again at food handling. It says equipment and fixtures used for storage, preparation, or handling of food that shall discharge through an indirect waste and specifies an air gap. So here's where we start to see specific situations and what they would expect to see, which is an air gap. Now, in this same section, it talks about food preparation sinks. And there's another requirement in here for any time that you know this sink is specifically for food preparation. Not dishes, but food preparation. Each well of the multiple compartment sink shall discharge independently to an indirect waste receptor. We see this on this illustration. This is a 3-compartment stainless steel commercial kitchen sink intended for the use of washing food. We'll put cabbage in there. We'll put carrots in there. But what if we put raw chicken in there? It needs a little bit of a rinse off. Chicken's going to have some pretty seriously contaminating bacterias that could contaminate another sink. So you can imagine here, I've got my lettuce and tomatoes and carrots over in the right-hand sink, and next to it I just washed some raw meat. I'm going to drop the sink down, and if all of those are connected, there is the potential for the wastewater to push up into another compartment sink. I mean, it's going from one up to the other as it's draining down. and that's pushing contaminants over into the sink basin where I have some fresh vegetables. This is a problem, right? And so this is where, very specifically, food preparation sinks with separate compartments have to be piped independently, separately from each other, to the indirect waste, so that we don't get those cross-contaminations. 802.1.2 talks about floor drains in food storage areas. So you're going to have a cooler or a freezer, these big walk-in freezers, right? Where you're storing foods, and those cooling systems are going to create some condensate. Those are going to be diverted to a floor drain or a receptacle through an air gap, as the code requires. And it's very important that that does not get clogged or frozen, right? So if you have a condensate drain and it's moving through that freezer, but the floor drain is in the freezer, then it's going to freeze up. It's going to cause big problems with that refrigeration unit. So specifically, the receptor has to be outside the unit and not subject to freezing. Moving on to 802.1.3, we'll look at potable clear water waste. Potable meaning this is coming from our potable water system. That would be the discharge or overflow from a water heater or other units of that nature, where it's clean water, but we just need to make sure it gets to a safe space if it's discharging, right? We don't want a big flooded mess. In these cases, it has to discharge through an air gap. So if we're creating the discharge pipe off of a TMP valve on a water heater, it has to have that specified air gap where it indirect wastes to the rest of the drainage system. 802.1.4 specifies how we handle swimming pools. Now, swimming pools sometimes are very involved with the amount of equipment and piping and systems for filtration, for heating, for chemical treatment. All of those mechanical systems are going to likely have some discharge pipes, right? If we need to drain them or if there's a problem and it opens up. So we have an indirect waste connection on any of those. And once again, it specifies swimming pools and swimming pool equipment through an air gap. We're going to have a floor drain in the mechanical room and an air gap from any of that equipment where it would simply waste down into that floor drain. 802.1.5, now we look at non-potable clear water waste. So that's referring to things like mechanical systems. We're going to put water into there. We're going to cycle that water through the building for heating or cooling purposes. But that water in those systems is going to include things like glycol or other chemicals that are going to preserve the piping and valves of the system. And that's the sort of stuff we definitely wouldn't want back in our potable, but we also don't want contaminated from the drains. So in these cases where it's non-potable clear water waste, it can be either through an air break or an air gap. And here's where we see that at times we are given options. You can do this or you can do that. Either way is okay. 802.1.6 gives us commercial dishwashing machines and two options. It can discharge through an air gap or through an air break. Let's look more specifically at dishwashers for a minute. And this applies very much to residential dishwashers. How do we handle the indirect waste of a dishwasher? Note in all of these, I'm going to throw out some illustrations here that we're using either an air gap or an air break. Here's an example. There's a Y connection fitting on the slip joints. The dishwasher drain comes up in the cabinet and down into the Y. This is an air break. Why is it an air break? Because it is below the flood level rim of the sink. The sink is on the countertop above. We're bringing that indirect waste into the drain above the trap, but below the flood level rim, so this is an air break. Here's another example in a single compartment, a simple Y tailpiece with the dishwasher drain into that. More often, probably, we'll just connect it to the disposal, right? Disposals have, or I should say in code terms, the food waste grinder. But our garbage disposals have a specific place for us to connect a dishwasher. As an experienced plumber, you and I know that you have to knock out that plug that's inside there if you're installing a new one. That's a real novice mistake if you leave it in there and try to turn on the dishwasher, find out it won't drain. But this is a good connection, and once again, we have an air break. It's coming up above where it drains into the trap, but below the flood level rim. And finally, in some jurisdictions, they require an actual air gap fitting. This is a drainage assembly that mounts in the countertop. It pushes the dishwasher waste up through and above the flood level rim of the sink, and then back down from that air gap drain assembly to the point of connection, whether it's the disposal or a dishwasher Y or whatever. Like I say, some jurisdictions require this, some states, I should say. Where I'm at in Utah, this is not required, and we're all glad for that because these are very problematic. They clog, they plug, they flood the top of the counter. People who have them generally don't like them. I personally haven't seen very many of these, but it does well fit within the code requirements because it is an air gap where it comes above the flood level rim and back down. Last one in this series, 802.1.7, food utensils, dishes, pots, and pan sinks. Any of those are going to have to discharge through an air gap or an air break. All right, hopefully this is making sense to you so far as we're examining Chapter 8 on indirect and special waste. We're going to stop this video here, and we're going to continue in the next video from 802.2, where we'll look at the materials used for indirect waste, and we'll talk more specifically about the installation. When we're putting these together and running the pipes, how does that come together? So I will see you in the next video.